Let's start this video by reading some well-measured responses talking about splits from yesterday's video. I've always thought the Race World First should be on the tournament realm. Splits are fine for viewers if they happen outside of the Race World First. Splits with simultaneous Heroic and Mythic raid releases make the situation much, much worse. To remove splits, you also need to do the same for Mythic Plus. Otherwise, spectator will be left to watch 3 days of a Mythic Plus grind. Honestly, these are actually not too bad.
Yeah, decent takes. When you said you were going to read some takes, I thought we were going to have some vitriol fired there. I do think there's drawbacks with a lot of those different solutions, right? Like
The
tournament realm is
one.
something that gets talked about all the time, but it does, that would be a big change that comes with some risks too. But yeah, good discussion. I'm proud of everybody for leaving those comments. Well done.
All right, so today what has happened is Mythic has began for both Liquid and Echo. So both of the two main contenders have entered Mythic. Liquid now sits at 6 out of 9, and they've pulled Smolderon a little bit. At the time of recording, we're going to talk about Smolderon here in a few minutes. Echo, at time of recording, has just finished their raid day. They have downed Larodar. It took them about an hour to down Larodar. And
not good.
Yeah, it seemed like it took them a long time. Liquid, I think, only took like 3 or 4 attempts, and they honestly, I think, could have one-shot it.
Liquid took 7 and Echo took like 15.
Yeah, I think it was one-shotable for Liquid. Like what they were wiping to was random stuff. Like there was like weak auras for a couple of pulls. There was it was just like a couple of like really small things that caused Liquid some wipes. But overall, Mythic has begun. The race is really starting to heat up, and now Smolderon seems to be the first kind of wall. And if you see. Liquid here has 14 pulls with a best of 29.4%. They're currently actually stationed waiting for the boss to get bug fixed, which I think has. So at the time that this video is released, you might even be able to watch them prog. And the bug that they're facing currently involves the Mythic mechanic, which are these orbs that are tethered to players. Occasionally, the orbs will double tick, and then just like so the orbs apply a vulnerability to your entire raid, and if you soak them too fast, they'll wipe you. And sometimes they'll double tick and just completely wipe your entire raid. Like you see right here, the vulnerability has faded on the screen, and then a player is going to hit the orb, and it's going to wipe the entire group because it's double ticking. But overall, so that's kind of what Liquid's waiting on. It's kind of difficult to tell where the enrage is going to be, what the damage on the boss is necessarily going to be, and is Smolderon downable today? Like those kind of things are up in the air. It's kind of difficult to tell because Liquid's not done progging the fight.
Yeah, instant dollars. Apparently, when in front of them, the boss got its health increased when they first reached it. So
that happens. That happens all the time. Do not people will read Farak buffs and people will read Smolderon got buffed in front of instant dollars. That literally happens every single race to multiple guilds.
Well, but it's the direction is interesting, right? Because sometimes bosses' healths are, over what they were thinking on everything, right? Sometimes they're after Halanders, right? Bosses were getting pre-nerfed. Some of the later bosses in Sepulchre are still very hard. But,
okay, sure.
So I think that it makes some sense that okay, the checks were probably a little bit lighter up to that point, and they wanted to make sure Smolderon wouldn't be that way as well. But yeah, you can't read too much into the 29% enrage wipe that Liquid had, because they're so far done from being done, from optimizing the fight and from of course getting a clean pull with everybody alive and doing all their damage properly and not having that bug wipe them as well, which I think it makes sense. You don't really want to prog that fight while a bug like that exists, because just anytime you're doing that Mythic mechanic, it could randomly wipe you. So not surprised that Liquid have decided to go do some M+ instead. Echo, it was weird to me. They stayed up until 12:30 a.m. local time.
I saw that
on Larodar, which I think that's cost them time. I don't know. I feel like they took longer on that boss than they needed to, partially because they started today at 8 a.m., doing their splits, and they did splits all day and Ferox all day. And then they got into, they started their Mythic prog, and they blasted out 3 easy bosses nice and easy. But then they did Larodar, which I think they probably underestimated the amount of mechanical and numerical check that boss had, because Liquid and instant dollars made it look so easy. But those guilds were pulling them, at the start of their days, whereas Echo at the end of their day were, and they still haven't committed any of their crafts and crests and stuff, right? So their item level is a little bit lower than where Liquid's is at.
I wish I had
I don't know.
I wish I had a good VOD of Echo pulled up, because something that I actually saw, you said they had 15 attempts on the fight. They kept wiping the enrage. They wiped to 2% on the enrage 5 or 6 times, and does that happen if they're well rested? Probably not.
It seemed weird. It seems like it's a bad decision to go and pull that boss instead of doing something like council and then
Council.
bed, or just straight
Yeah.
up bed. Bed would not have been bad call. I feel like they're maybe a little bit burned though by Aberrus, where you know Aberrus, you're trying to preserve your sleep schedule, get ready for a nice long race, and then bang, the race is over, and you're like, hang on,
Okay.
we never used our extra energy reserves. But I don't think early bosses are a good place to do that. So I don't know. I think this is. I think that this will be something where if the race ends up with like an hour difference between the two teams and Echo loses as a result, they'll come back and they'll look at this day as like, yeah,
Mhm.
we lost some time here. That being said, they are still making up time, right? Like they got into Mythic on their third day, right? Whereas Liquid didn't
Yeah.
actually start Mythic until their fourth day. So Echo were able to get through their splits faster. They did get a little bit less item level out of everything, but they are holding a lot of resources of crafts and stuff. But I don't think they'll be able to hold them for
Li-
long once they reach Smolderon. So
the
yeah,
number of Ferox for Liquid, by the way, was 17.
yeah. I don't know what Echoes was because I was asleep all day, but I suspect
It's a
it was
lot.
comparable.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You see this private aura stuff for Smolderon? So
yeah. Disgusting.
the mythic mechanic for Smolderon, those orbs that you saw, when we were looking at that vulnerability weak aura, that's attached to a private aura. And so historically, you're not even able to interact with these in any way. Like it'll give you like a question mark box if you try to interact with them inside of weak auras. Liquid has designed a workaround which involves chat channels, pressing
It's
a
macro,
macro.
right?
Yes, pressing a
Yeah.
macro to post something into a chat channel, and then it pops up on screen who's going to soak the orb in what order.
And that's it's very similar to the Echo of Neltharion macro
Yes.
weak aura solution that a lot of guilds ended up using for that fight. And so basically, if this mechanic wasn't a private aura, what would happen is the orbs would come out, they would target 4 people, and then a weak aura would put those four
Assign them.
people on a list and
Yes.
assign them a 1, 2, 3, and 4 of who's going to soak, and then tell you how long the vulnerability is until you don't soak, and then soak. Right now, instead, the exact same process has to happen, but instead of it being a relatively easy weak aura to make, you do need a skilled programmer to be able to make the weak aura with the macro and everything,
It's
which
this right
Liquid
here.
and Echo, of course, have, right? But everybody else doesn't. And you need the people who get targeted to press a macro. Um, I believe this is moderately worse than just
Uh,
not having it be a private aura, and
I
it's substantially worse for the perspective of like it makes it harder to get into mythic rating. Like
yes.
if you're going to do Smolderon and you're trying to do Smolderon, a large portion of that for a lot of mythic guilds now is going to be it's not there's not going to be guilds that YOLO this mechanic. They're gonna almost
Correct.
everybody is going to do the macro, and you can't just have like one player in the guild decide that you're not going to use the macro. If you're as a guild are using the macro, everybody has to do it and learn it, and there's going to be a lot of learning curve of like, okay, everybody get the macro, everybody get this weak aura going. So
Yeah.
Blizzard either needs to find a way to make that also not work, and to continue escalating this arms race and preventing these weak aura solutions from having these workarounds that happen, or they need to just not make this a private aura. And if they're okay with the gameplay of this being done with weak aura help with systematization, then that would be a really easy solution to make this a lot less annoying. Because as it stands right now, this is a very annoying. This is a mechanic that would have not been that annoying, but it also would not have been that challenging. And now it is still not that challenging, but it is
And
very
it's annoying.
annoying, and
Yep.
it requires like a either a giga programmer on your guild, or it says, okay, wait until Liquid or Echo finish clearing the raid and release their weak auras, and then use their weak auras and their macros, and
Yeah.
like that is really stupid in my opinion.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that stance. I don't know. Like I think that this is well, it's definitely against the spirit of what the private auras are supposed to solve.
Yeah, I mean, you could get mad. You could look at this and be like, "Oh, the players are wrong for use it for working around this." But I think it's more like this should have been obvious, right? Like we saw it with Deco Neltharion. This is what people are going to do,
Yeah.
and Blizzard either needs to answer that or stop doing these private auras on this kind of mechanic. There are still some kind of mechanics that wouldn't be done with a macro. I think, like I think if you did Anduin Blasphemy again and you private aura that mechanic, Echo just wouldn't weak aura it. They would just YOLO it in the same way that Liquid did at the time, because that would be enough of a push over the edge to move them from thinking weak
Yeah.
auras were the best to thinking that reactive gameplay was the best. So I think there's a place for private auras with the possibility of macros, but it is much more narrow than what Blizzard is doing, which is just slapping private aura on a bunch of mechanics and hoping that people will play them reactively when that's just not the most optimal way to do it. It's still more optimal to just spend the extra brain global to press a macro instead, and have somebody spend 10 hours programming a macro in a week, or which is again a big accessibility concern. I think.
I agree. I think the accessibility concerns is like a pretty big deal. I mean, this is the 7th boss of the Mythic raid. This is not something that a lot of people are doing anyways.
But a lot of guilds that reach this before the Echo and Liquid weak auras are available. But
yeah,
anything that moves the race in the direction of there being more barriers to be competitive in it, I always think is
it just feels wrong.
Unfortunate.
It just feels wrong that they need to do this, right? Like I don't. For the record, I do not blame the players. I think it's just silly that this is what the resolution of what a private aura has come to. I think that's the problem. Like, this is bad experiment
from Blizzard. I just this should have been pretty predictable that this was going to be how this mechanic was solved after seeing Echo of Neltharion, right? Like, it's the exact same thing that happened there. I think that's this should have been a bit more foreseen. Sure. And basically, like, if Blizzard is okay with this, I disagree. I think that this is much worse than just not having it be a private aura. And if they're not okay with this, well, they should have seen it coming, and they should have either not made it a private aura or buffed private auras in some way where this also wouldn't work on them, which then maybe there'd be another workaround. But if they keep playing whack-a-mole and breaking each workaround as it comes out, that might take a couple tiers, but then eventually we might get to a place where they get what they want, with these being truly impossible to actually have a weak aura solve.
Any of the Echo guys over there talking about difficulty of the raid tier, just more broadly speaking? Because it seems like it's been a point of conversation, at least on Twitter, a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the first 6 bosses ended up being very easy for ID and Liquid, and Smolderon has the looks of being maybe a first actual wall boss. I think don't read too much into the first 6 of 9 bosses being that easy. That is a lot more normal than people kind of remember after any given tier. Like, if you look back at Castle Nathria, people were on Sludgefist by the end of day 1, right? Like, Liquid got to Sludgefist by the end of day 1. It's very normal for the first half of the raid or more to just die instantly. Jaina was reached on day 1. It's not like the difficulty of the raid. When we talk about difficulties of the raid, it matters a lot more how hard the last 3 bosses are than the first 6. That's the first 6
for this raid. Yes, for this raid.
For the race world first, yeah. And sometimes there's random walls in the first 6, but this raid didn't have any, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's also not necessarily a good thing. It can go either way, right? Like, we'll have to just see. A lot of that matters. Like, are the last 3 bosses each hard? Because if all 3 of those bosses are difficult bosses that give a satisfying progression experience in the race to world first, then I think they'll be happy with it.
I think Tags and Jet both had pretty good points, where some people were talking about how it's too easy because mythic bosses are going down. And I think maybe there's this allure of like every boss is a hard boss, but that's just not how mythic raiding works. And Tags even cites all of these raids, I mean, that have had 6 or more mythic bosses killed. I remember Antorus literally all the way through Agrimar was killed the first day, right?
Yeah, I mean,
it's like,
I think the raw number of bosses is a little bit the wrong thing to look at here, because you kind of want to look at like the percentage of bosses.
Yes.
Like 2/3 of the bosses, which obviously like a 10 or 11 or 12 boss raid, that would be more bosses than 9, but it's still a good point. Yeah, I think it is very much this like memory thing. And I think it's just this thing of like, during splits, Twitch chatters are looking at that leaderboard and just seeing guilds shoot up the numbers and being like, oh my God, why are you doing splits at this pace? Instant dollars are going to have world first in 6 hours. And you're just like, no, that's not how this works.
I mean, ID's not going to have the item level. They're just going to get item leveled out at some point.
Probably, yeah. I mean, and possibly not. Like, Xavius was a good example of a tier where it's like, okay, actually, yeah, you could just go all the way through that tier, and that is a risk in any given tier. But I think at this point, Blizzard are on their fingers are on the trigger enough to just panic buff the later bosses if they need to, if they're in danger of another Xavius happening.
Yeah. I think overall in the next 24 hours, kind of what we're starting to expect. I think from Liquid, I would expect Smolderon to either become a major wall that requires a lot more Mythic Plus splits, or Smolderon goes down probably before day's end, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
I think one of the 2 of those is the most likely for Liquid, and then they come in and they start progging Tendril tomorrow.
I wouldn't be surprised, if this time tomorrow, Smolderon, like when we're recording this, which will be towards the end of Liquid's day, Smolderon may be dead for them, and probably I bet Echo will go to bed with it low, but not dead.
Oh, really? I think that Echo's killing Smolderon tomorrow.
Okay.
I think if Liquid kills Smolderon tonight, then Echo is killing it.
Yeah, if Liquid kill it tonight,
Yes.
I was guessing Liquid would maybe kill it during their next day. But
Okay,
yeah, if Liquid
okay,
kill it
okay.
before Echo wake up, then they will be very sad if they don't kill it before they go to bed. Then they'll be like giga
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah.
Because right now, Echo are going to bed behind Liquid, but they're going to bed ahead of where Liquid were when Liquid went to bed yesterday, which is like the same number of days since the raid came out for each region, right? So that's kind of like a neutral position to be in, right? At some point during the race, usually Echo gets to a point where they're going to bed actually ahead, and then they're waking up behind, and that's when the race is like getting really heats up. And then if they ever get to a point where they wake up ahead, they've never lost a tier where that's happened.
Yeah.
Right? If Echo ever wake up in the lead, that's how the tier ends usually.
And if they ever wake up behind, then they're probably gonna lose. There is
if they go to bed behind, that's like after.
No, I mean if
it's deep into Mythic.
Yeah, I mean there's situations where they go to bed behind and wake up behind and stuff like that too, where it's like, oh
yeah, I mean that's normal up until a certain point in the tier, right? Like that happened for the first several weeks or for the first week and part of the second week of Sepulcher, because of course they start behind, right?
Let's block that one out.
At some point they have to catch up and overtake, but depending on the length of the tier, they have some time for that, and that's the question, right? Is like, will Smolderon and Tindral and Farrakh be long enough bosses for them to have that opportunity? Because Aberrus kind of had the chance for them, but it would have required perfect play for them to actually be able to overtake. I think it didn't happen.
I think Farrakh is actually a very cool encounter. I'm interested in seeing how it fares on Mythic. That is a fight that can be honestly like an all-time great fight if they design it super well. I think what it shows on Heroic is, I feel like it's pretty in-depth, and there's some things that I think are bad about it. Like I think just like the healer perspective in general is not ideal for that encounter, but specifically like clicking the frames and whatnot. But I'm interested in seeing like how Farrakh Mythic fares for these guilds.
Yeah, it's going to be really cool to see. Maybe something we'll be talking about tomorrow, potentially.
Oh,
if Tindral and Smolderon fall over fast, it could be a topic for the future.
I hope Tindral's not a flop. That would be sad.
Yeah.
Anyways, any final thoughts?
Nope.
All right, cool. I think we're out of here today. We'll be back tomorrow. Later, gamers.
Later, gamers.